Hi, I'm Steve Palumbi, and this is video lecture number 2 in the science of the extreme life of the sea. And today, we're going to talk about life beginning in the ocean, the evolution of life from its earlier time on. But before we get started, we're going to basically get a quick 47-second lesson about the diversity of life in the ocean. Here goes. So, a little glimpse of the diversity of life in the sea. And it turns out that when we start looking around the planet, the ocean is not only the biggest biological habitat with the most critters in it, but it has the most variety of different kinds of critters. Critters that live in the ocean, this wide range of different body plans, represents the long history of life in the ocean. Life evolved in the ocean. It's been living in the ocean far longer than on land and has had the opportunity to diversify more than life on land. We look back in the history of the Earth, then we have to go back 4 billion years to capture the first emergence of life. Planet is about 4.5 billion years old, and for the first 700 million years or so, there was almost constant bombardment of planet Earth by comets and asteroids. And as they come streaking in, a large comet or asteroid has enough momentum, has enough kinetic energy to actually melt the planet. So for those 700 million years, the planet was constantly being bombarded, would melt, would reform, would be bombarded again. And obviously life can't evolve under those circumstances. But once the inner solar system began to be cleared out of those big asteroids and comets, then those overheating periods became fewer and fewer. Water could exist on planet Earth, and life could begin to evolve. Actually, when we think that the first environment was capable of supporting life on Earth about 3.8 billion years or so, it didn't take more than a couple 100 million years for the first signs of life to show up. So where did the first elements of life come from on a lifeless planet? An experiment done decades ago called the Miller-Urey experiment took the components of the early Earth's atmosphere and basically ran electric sparks through those components. There was water, there was ammonium, there was hydrogen, there was carbon monoxide and ammonia. And what the Miller-Urey experiment discovered was that just this simple interaction between the elements of the early atmosphere and something simple like lightning, it could produce simple amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and simple nucleosides, the building blocks of DNA. Now, they weren't very thick. There wasn't a thick soup of these biological materials. It was a relatively thin one. But over millions of years, the idea is that those non-biologically produced molecules that we all now use in our biological machines began to accumulate on early Earth. Fast forward a little bit, about 3.5 billion years ago, and we begin to see evidence of early life on the planet. Now, first, that evidence comes from what looked like the ability of early organisms to take carbon dioxide, molecules and form them together into larger carbon-based structures. And we can tell that by the isotopic composition of those early organic molecules in rocks that are 3.5 billion years ago. We can also see the record of that in the diversification of life that happened about that time. We can see that by looking at modern life now and then tracing back in time how that modern life is related to one another. This is the early tree of life. It's called a phylogenetic tree, and it shows three major branches. The bacteria, including the normal things we think of as, say, bacteria that we encounter every day in our own lives. Eukaryotes, which include all of the advanced animals and plants that we can think about. And then a set of other single-celled critters called the archaea. These all used to be classified as bacteria. Now we separate them out with the eubacteria as one line and the archaea as another. You can see that this entire tree comes together very, very deep in the tree. This point here probably occurred about 3.5 billion years ago. We can begin to see fossils of bacteria in rocks that are about 3 billion years old. These are just some images of some of those fossils that have been dug up. Archaea are also sometimes called extremophiles because they live in extreme environments. This is a shot of a hot spring, and then the life you can see in the hot spring, because you can see the color along here, is driven by these archaea, these single-celled primitive living systems, living critters that can live in water as hot as 60, 70, 80 degrees. So the first couple of billion years of life on planet Earth really was a time of single-celled critters, these three forms of life. So along the way, these bacteria evolved the ability to use photosynthesis, that is, using light energy to join together CO2 molecules into bigger organic structure. And that's a game changer early in the history of life, because all of a sudden, the availability of food, of these long-chain organic carbon compounds, goes up enormously. Before that, it was all produced by reactions like in the Miller-Urey experiment at a very low rate. After photosynthesis, then the food supply of the planet went way up. But there was a problem. That photosynthesis joins together CO2 molecules, but it has a byproduct. And that byproduct is oxygen. So a little earlier than 1 billion years ago, oxygen concentrations started to build up in the atmosphere. At that point, the metabolism of organisms that were evolving then could use oxygen, combine it with long-chain carbon molecules that they gathered up in the environment, and then using aerobic respiration, they could get a lot more energy out of consuming these large organics that were in the environment. So the first stage in upping the food supply was photosynthesis. The second stage was using aerobic metabolism instead of anaerobic metabolism to gain more energy from the same amount of carbon-based food. So that both of those things upped the level of energy available to early life. So at this point, 80% of the age of the Earth, there are only single-cell organisms. But about 850 million years ago, in a geological period called the Ediacaran, then we began to see fossils that are evidence for multicellular life forming in the Earth's early seas. So this is one of the kinds of images we get from the Ediacaran, and then this is another one. It's not all that clear what this really is. Some people have looked at it and said it looks like an early kind of cnidarian or an early kind of jellyfish. Other people have looked at it and said it must be a fungus. What's pretty clear is it's a multicellular form of life, no matter what kind of life it might be. That's 800 million years ago. Jump forward a little bit to about 550 million years ago, and what we see is an explosion of life, all in the ocean still, out of fossils from a place called the Burgess Shale. This is a set of fossils that has become known as the Cambrian explosion. And what you can see here is a bit of rock with an impression of it, of a critter called a trilobite. Trilobites are kind of early arthropods. They're segmented. They have different segments making up the body. They have an exoskeleton with limbs and legs. And trilobites were one of the most common kinds of crustaceans or arthropods rather, in the early Cambrian. They become quite familiar. They're bilaterally symmetrical, meaning they're the same on both sides of the midline. They have an obvious head, legs. They make sense given what we think we know about the way arthropods are built. But then there's other organisms like this. It's hard to know what the front end is or the back end, or how this particular critter works. And that's one of the amazing features of the Burgess Shale. It has in it organisms that fit really well with our conception of what the diversity of life is now, but it also has organisms that we have no idea what they're related to. These are two kinds of fossils that we see in the Burgess Shale. Opabinia and Pikaia are both kinds of critters that are based upon familiar methods of building critters, but they actually don't fit in with any of the modern phyla that we know exists. Opabinia, for example, the constructions based upon the Burgess Shale show it to have a propulsive tail, and it's segmented, sort of like a trilobite. It has 5 eyes instead of sort of a bilateral number. One of the strangest things is that its mouth under here is backward facing instead of forward facing. And it has this prehensile trunk with claspers on it that make it look like it's well designed to be a predator eating other organisms, and that prehensile trunk essentially shoving the prey into the mouth. There's nothing like this anymore in any of our living species. Whatever this was died out in the Burgess Shale. Pikaia, by contrast, is different, but it has some of the features that make us think that it's the creatures that evolved from it still live on. It originally was called a worm, but in fact, when you look very carefully at the most detailed fossils, it looks like this organism has a little bit of a backbone growing in it, which would make it the first critter in the history of life that had a backbone like ours. It was fairly rare. It didn't last long in the fossil record. And it, as a sort of set of species, has died out. It's still possible that either its descendants evolved into lineages that led to us, or that we share a common ancestor that had one of these early backbones. Well, if we think about how these different critters have come to be and where they went, question is, well, why were there so many in the early Burgess Shale? What caused this explosion of diversity? And why did we have so many things like this that subsequently died out? So one of the possibilities there is a theory called the theory of the empty barrel that tries to explain what was going on evolutionarily at this period of time in the Earth's history. And it kind of goes like this, that the Cambrian world was not really very crowded with organisms. They were just evolving. They were beginning to fill up the planet. Competition for resources was not yet fierce because there weren't that many types of organisms that had evolved yet and hadn't had the time to build up huge populations around the world. And in that kind of environment, the empty barrel hypothesis is that if you have an empty barrel, you can fill it with just about anything. And it didn't matter whether they were very well-designed organisms or they were highly efficient or they could reproduce well. All they had to do was be sufficient to survive for that period of time. They had little competition for anything else. And so lots of different body plans may well have been quite fine in that era. Later, as the barrel filled, competition for resources became more and more and more important, meaning that types of organisms, species, even phyla, that were not as efficient and did not have exactly the same ability to take resources in, reproduce, et cetera, those organisms, the less efficient ones, were outcompeted by the more efficient ones. That would lead to the reduction in diversity so that things like this critter would be outcompeted by later species that came along. And we don't know whether that was really what was happening at that particular time in the Cambrian explosion, but it explains this huge diversification and then its winnowing out over time. But it also lets us start to think of, well, what were the evolutionary stages along the way? What were the times and places that things that we take for granted now actually evolved for the first time? And let's take teeth, for example. This is a great white shark. That's the tooth of a great white shark. Where were they invented? Who was the first kind of critter to invent teeth? Well, it turns out that those were the sharks about 420 million years ago when sharks evolved. They were the only species at that point that had teeth. Other critters had jaws, they had beaks, they had claspers, they had spines, they had other sharp objects, but sharks actually invented teeth. They invented them, grew them in a very specific way that allows them to be some of the sharpest objects naturally made in the planet. A shark's tooth, for example, can be 5 times sharper than a razor blade. And they're so sharp, actually, that they wear quickly. And so sharks don't just produce one set of teeth in their adult life, say, like we do, but they're constantly producing teeth so that they can be used as sharp as they're made. As they wear out, they're replaced by another set of teeth that are also being made and ready to be used right next to them. So sharks invented teeth. What other sorts of events along the way happened that led to the evolution of structures that we see around us all the time? What about predation? One organism eating another. It's probably some sort of predation was going on in single-celled organisms way back in billions of years ago. But when multicellular organisms began, what was the first set of multicellular organisms that ate other multicellular organisms? Probably that began around the Cambrian explosion and a little bit earlier, because there was enough food supply because of aerobic metabolism to allow populations to grow up and be big enough to be valuable sources of prey. Legs. Where were the first legs? Crustaceans had some of the first legs that we see in the fossil record, although lots of different phyla now have different kinds of legs. We see them first in the arthropods in the early Cambrian. It may well be that the evolution of shells and the evolution of predation go together, because once predators became abundant in the ocean, then it made sense evolutionarily for organisms to evolve defenses against those predators. And that leads some people to think that the reason for the Cambrian explosion, this diversification of life in the fossil record, was as much to do with the fact that those organisms now had hard parts, like shells and carapaces and claws and beaks, that would fossilize. And so even though they might have existed on the planet before the Cambrian explosion, perhaps they were more soft-bodied and didn't get preserved so well in the fossil record. So the huge diversification of different forms in the Cambrian might have been a combination of this diversification of life, but also the armoring of life, making them more fossilizable. A couple of things to think about, like that had to evolve at some point. For example, swimming. Certainly single-celled organisms were floating around in the ocean, but once multicellular creatures began to be formed, most of the ones from the early part of the Cambrian, especially the ones with shells, were bottom-dwelling benthic forms like the early crinoids, like the trilobites, which were the critters that began to come off the bottom of the ocean for the first time and use that third dimension. What were the first ones to swim? And there we go back to the early cephalopods. They were able to counteract the heaviness of their shells by having gas built into the chambers inside their shells. Example of that is the chambered nautilus. It allows it to float up above the surface and essentially swim around, even though it's a heavy shell-protected creature. Jaws were invented by fish even before sharks evolved, but sharks get the record for evolving teeth. At that point, by the time sharks are around 420 million years ago, the oceans are full of life, and life has begun to crawl up on land, beginning to spin out the types of forms that we see around us all the time. We have to always look at the organisms that are in the ocean as a combination of modern creatures like the white shark and ancient lineages, a lineage in this case that's lasted 400 million years or so, and realize that the way it's living its life is sometimes set by its basic features, in this case, teeth that are constantly reformed and regrown, but also that have overlaid on that an adaptive evolutionary ability to live in different circumstances in different ways that might be new. In the case of white sharks, for example, very lately, in the last couple of tens of millions of years, this lineage has evolved warm bodies, that is endothermia, and has sent this whole lineage into a different trajectory that sharks had ever had earlier. So this gives us a sort of perspective from 3.8 billion years ago up to the evolution of modern life in the ocean, where it came from, the kinds of diversity that exists. And we're going to take that information over the next couple of lectures and think about, well, what kinds of ecosystems did these early creatures live in? What do we know about certain kinds of them? We're going to focus first on the smallest critters in the ocean, the microbes.